And in the best of the rest of the news, the Japanese aren't the only ones who are continuing to suffer from the fallout of the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And now it appears that radiation released from the failed Fukushima reactors back in March of 2011, more than 2 years ago, have affected children born in Hawaii and along the entire west coast of the United States. According to the Radiation and Public Health Project, children born in Alaska, California, Hawaii, Washington State, and Oregon between 1 week and 16 weeks after the nuclear meltdown were 28% more likely to suffer from congenital hypothyroidism than were kids born in those states during the same time a year earlier in 2010. Basically what happened is large quantities of radioactive iodine-131 were blown out of the Fukushima reactors and then traveled across the Pacific Ocean before falling on Hawaii, the West Coast, and other Pacific nations in the form of rain and snow that reached radiation levels hundreds of times greater than those considered safe. And research suggests that the fallout from Fukushima will only get worse. So just how bad will the effects of the nuclear fallout get? And what's the latest coming out of Fukushima today? Joining us now is Kevin Camps, nuclear waste watchdog with Beyond Nuclear. Kevin, welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So Kevin, are you surprised by some of this new information? I mean, were we expecting these sort of fallout effects on the West Coast?
Well, we knew in the first days and weeks and months after the Fukushima catastrophe began that we were receiving fallout, radioactive fallout in precipitation. I remember one day in April of 2011 when it was reported by the U.S. federal government that Boise, Idaho had had rainfall that measured 242 times the Safe Drinking Water Act limits for radioactive iodine-131. So we knew that we were getting fallout. In places like Kalamazoo, Michigan, where I'm sitting right now, they got elevated fallout of different isotopes, including cesium. So these are reported by the federal government agencies of the United States.
If Kalamazoo, Michigan has it, then the entire world almost has to have it. I mean, Kalamazoo is on the other side of the world. Am I right?
Certainly in terms of atmospheric fallout, the prevailing winds carried it throughout the northern hemisphere. And then with the ocean discharges from Fukushima, which are unprecedented, the currents took those all over the place, including the southern hemisphere. So the health impacts should not be a surprise. They're tragic. And we've known since the 1950s, actually the U.S. nuclear establishment in its secrecy knew since the 1950s that radioactive iodine will cause thyroid pathology downwind. They were doing secret experiments at the Hanford Nuclear Reservation in the 1950s. We found out about it in the 1990s under President Clinton when it was finally revealed. And if anybody had any doubts, the Chernobyl catastrophe that began in 1986 had an eruption of thyroid pathology in Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. By comparison, Poland, as soon as it found out about the Chernobyl catastrophe, some days into it because of the cover-up by the Soviets, immediately distributed potassium iodide pills to its population. They do not have a thyroid epidemic in Poland.
So given you said that there's a long history of knowing the effects of what happens when these sort of nuclear disasters occur, and you said we have these tests, we knew this was coming. How has our government handled this knowledge and prepared for it?
Deafening silence. In fact, Congressman Ed Markey, a Democrat from Massachusetts, a decade ago now, got a bill passed into law, got it enacted. It's the law of the land, calling for potassium iodide distribution out to 20 miles away from U.S. atomic reactors. A brilliant thing to do, very wise, this precautionary step to have the potassium iodide in place in case a nuclear catastrophe unfolds in the United States. They don't happen slowly. They happen very quickly, as we saw at Fukushima. The pills have to be close by. I should hasten to add that the pills would only protect the thyroid against radioactive iodine-131. It will not protect you against dozens of other radioactive poisons. So it's really to protect your thyroid during the evacuation, and then for some weeks and months after you've evacuated to protect you against radioactive iodine contamination of food and water. But the Bush administration and the Obama administration have both dragged their feet. They have not implemented this law. It's hard to tell if it's been carried out anywhere, certainly not adequately.
So Kevin, the next question for you. So being that's the case, like what can Americans do to protect themselves, and what's next to happen in the United States on this?
Well, Congressman Markey, to his credit, is still calling for the potassium iodide to be distributed within 20 miles. He's calling for the Obama administration to enforce the law of the land to protect Americans. We saw in Fukushima, a highly technological, wealthy country, Japan, that they were in chaos when the Fukushima catastrophe erupted, including on the threat of radioactive iodine-131. In fact, I remember when the federal government of Japan was warning the parents of small children in Tokyo not to use tap water to make infant formula with because it was too contaminated with radioactive iodine-131. Use bottled water for infant formula. So it was chaos. And what we need to do, of course, the best thing we can do is shut down all the atomic reactors in this country, because without atomic reactors, you can't have iodine-131. It has a relatively short half-life of 8 days. That's 80 days to 160 days of hazardous persistence. Then it's gone. But during that 160 days, it's a vicious radioactive poison, and we see that in the former Soviet Union to this day, an epidemic of thyroid pathology. And the treatment in a place like Belarus is referred to as a Chernobyl necklace. It's a slit from ear to ear, really across the throat, to remove the thyroid.